The man had been lying in the mud for nearly 3 minutes before anyone thought to help him. Nara saw him from the kitchen garden, her arms full of bundled sage and late-season rosemary, the cold morning pressing damp against her collar. She saw the way he had fallen, not sideways the way a drunk man falls, not forward the way an exhausted one does, but straight down, like a tree that has been cut clean at the root. One moment upright, the next gone. The stable hands who had been walking past him simply stepped around. One glanced back, the other did not. The palace steward, Lord Cavan, was crossing the far courtyard at that exact moment and deliberately chose a different path rather than involve himself with something uncertain. Nara set her herbs on the stone wall and walked toward the man. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in plain dark wool that had once been expensive and was now torn along one sleeve and stiff with dried blood at the temple. His face was turned to the side, pressed against the flagstones of the outer courtyard near the kitchen passage. He was breathing. She checked that first, crouching close enough to feel the shallow warmth of exhaled air against her wrist. "Sir." She touched his shoulder. "Nothing." She pressed harder. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes opened. They were gray. Not the pale, washed-out gray of old ash, but deep charcoal gray, the gray of storm-gathered clouds just before lightning decides where it wants to go. Those eyes looked at her with the full weight of a man who was used to being looked at, and then something shifted behind them. A careful, deliberate blankness settled into place, like a door pulled shut, where his voice came out rough. He stopped, and she could see him take inventory of himself the way a soldier does, cataloging damage. "You're in the outer courtyard of Varenthorn Palace," she said. "You've hit your head. Do you know your name?" A long pause. Long enough that she thought he had slipped unconscious again. "No," he said. Her name was Nara Fell, and she had been a kitchen maid at Varenthorn for 4 years, long enough to know which tiles in the Great Hall were loose, which of the understewards accepted a bribed pastry, and which palace officials were the kind of men who would step around a stranger bleeding in a courtyard. She had come to the palace the way most low-born girls came to great houses, through a cousin's recommendation, a small lie about previous experience, and the particular kind of pride that presents itself as willingness. She could cook, not merely produce food that sustained life. She could genuinely cook, in the way that required instinct and patience and an understanding of how flavor builds like trust, slowly, through accumulated small decisions. She had wanted nothing more from Varenthorn than steady wages and the chance to send money home to her younger sister in the Thornvale settlement, 2 days' ride east. She had not wanted complications. She had certainly not wanted a large, wounded stranger with a suspiciously convenient loss of memory taking up residence in the storage room adjacent to the kitchen garden because every other space in the palace was either occupied or locked. But there he was. The palace physician, old Master Brennick, had examined the man, confirmed no fracture, pronounced the memory loss common enough after a significant blow, and suggested rest and warm broth. Then he had filed his report with Lord Cavan and apparently washed his hands of the situation. Lord Cavan had ordered the stranger housed in the servants' wing pending identification and had assigned no one to see to his meals because the man was, technically, not a guest, not a prisoner, and not a documented inhabitant of anything, which meant Nara was the one who brought him soup. Not because she had been ordered to, because it was the sensible thing to do. She knocked on the storage room door. They had moved him to one of the smaller vacant rooms that adjoined it, a space used for linen overflow, now cleared, and entered without waiting because she had seen him walk unaided to the room 3 hours earlier and could reasonably conclude he was conscious. He was sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, looking at his own hands. "I brought broth," she said, "and bread. The bread is from yesterday, but I heated it." He looked up. That careful blankness again, but underneath it she caught something she could not quite name. Not confusion. Something more controlled than confusion. "Thank you," he said. She set the tray on the small table, turned to go. "You're not going to ask me questions?" he said. She stopped. "That's not my responsibility." "What is your responsibility?" "The kitchen." She paused at the door. And apparently this, for the moment, she meant the broth. She meant the bread. She did not mean him, as a man, as a mystery, as someone she would need to think about past the end of the working day. She intended that very clearly. She went back to the kitchen. She thought about him all evening anyway, and she resented it considerably. His name, as it would turn out, was Aldrich. Not that he told her. Not that he told anyone, in the first few days. The palace was in a particular kind of chaos during that period, because the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, all 4 territories of it, comprising Varenthorn and the 3 outer provinces, was missing, had been missing for 6 days. The royal party that had escorted him toward the Thornwater border for a treaty negotiation had returned without him, their account fragmented and disturbing, an ambush on the road. Scattered pack members, the king last seen fighting through a cluster of armed men at a river crossing. No body recovered. No ransom demand delivered. Nara had heard this from the undercooks, who had heard it from the senior chamberlain's assistant, who had heard it from someone she probably should not have been speaking with. The palace ran on this kind of whispered information the way machinery ran on grease. Invisibly, necessarily, and you only noticed it when it stopped. She had not connected the stranger in the linen room to the missing king. She would think about that later, about her own capacity to look directly at something and see only what she expected to see. On the 3rd morning, she brought him porridge and found him standing at the small window, watching the training yard below. There were guards drilling. He watched them the way a craftsman watches another craftsman, not for entertainment, not with admiration, but with professional assessment. "You know something about that," she said, setting the bowl down. "Do I?" He turned from the window. "The way you're watching. You're counting the gaps in their formation. You're looking at the space between the 2nd and 3rd man on the right and thinking it's too wide." He said nothing for a moment. "Maybe I was a soldier." "Maybe," she said. She looked at his hands again, the way she had noticed herself doing. The skin was rough across the knuckles. Yes, but there was something else. A specific kind of rough. Not the roughness of a man who grips weapons. The roughness of a man who signs documents, who presses a seal into wax, whose hands are strong but whose daily labor is conducted with a pen. She filed that observation away and said nothing. "The broth last night had juniper in it," he said. "I didn't expect that. It helps with inflammation. Master Brennick might call it medicine if he were a less proud man." The corner of his mouth moved. "You cook like it's an argument you're having with the ingredients." She had not expected that. She looked at him more directly than she had allowed herself to before. "That," she said, "is the most accurate description of my cooking I have ever heard." She left before the conversation could become something else. But she thought, walking back through the kitchen passage, that a man who had lost his memory should not be making observations that precise. That kind of noticing took practice, and it took a person who was accustomed to paying attention to things that others dismissed. She started paying closer attention. The question of the stranger's identity was less urgently pursued by the palace officials than Nara would have expected. Lord Cavan, who served as chief steward and acting authority while the king was missing, seemed to have very little curiosity about the man. He had sent one junior clerk to ask the stranger 3 questions, received 3 useless answers, and apparently moved on. There was no investigation, no summons to the Great Hall, no effort to determine if the man might have been part of the royal traveling party. That struck her as wrong. She was not a woman who distrusted her instincts. For years in a palace kitchen had trained them well. She knew the difference between a man who forgot to add salt and a man who decided not to. One was careless, the other was making a choice. She knew the difference between a guest who was difficult and one who was afraid. She knew the palace's rhythms well enough to feel when something had broken the rhythm and the sound had been deliberately muffled. She was thinking about this on the 5th day when the stranger found his way to the kitchen door at mid-afternoon, when the room was quiet between meal preparations. She turned from the work table. "You shouldn't be walking around the servants' wing. You weren't going to come until evening." "No," she agreed. "I wasn't." He looked around the kitchen with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that comprehensive scanning look, like someone reading a room for information rather than simply occupying it. He looked at the copper pots ranked by size, at the 2 locked cabinets on the far wall, at the window's position relative to the exterior of the building. "What do you actually want?" she asked. "I want to know something," he said. "Is Lord Cavan a competent man?" The question was specific enough to confirm several things at once. He knew who Lord Cavan was. He had either been given that name or already knew it. He was asking not out of curiosity, but because the answer mattered to something he was calculating. Nara set down her knife. "He's effective," she said carefully. When effectiveness serves him, and when it doesn't. Then he's cautious. She paused. He didn't look very hard for you. No. The word had a particular weight. He didn't. She wiped her hands on her work cloth and gave him her full attention. Who are you? He looked at her. That storm-gray gaze, steady and measuring. A man with a headache who likes your cooking, he said. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. She decided to find out herself. She was not naive enough to think she could investigate the way a lord might. She could not demand records, could not summon witnesses, could not access the sealed administrative chambers in the palace's east wing. But she had 4 years of accumulated access and invisibility, and she had learned that people who are not considered important are rarely considered present either. She started with the kitchen store's ledger, not because she expected answers there, but because it was hers to examine, and because things that enter a palace have to be provisioned for. The stranger had arrived on a Tuesday. What had been received at the kitchen gate on Tuesday morning? She checked the gate registry, which the head kitchen boy maintained for the purpose of tracking deliveries. Produce from 3 suppliers. A delivery of oil. And a notation she had not placed there herself. 1 additional portion, personal request, steward's order. The steward's order. Not the physician's. Not a general welfare allocation. A personal request from Lord Cavan, who had claimed minimal interest in the stranger. She sat with that for a long evening. On the 6th day, she brought the stranger breakfast and found him dressed in clothes that were no longer torn. Someone had brought him better clothes. She had not been told to. She had not done it. Who brought you those? She asked. A servant I didn't recognize. He didn't give a name. What did he look like? Young. Brown hair, nervous hands, a ring on his right finger that was too large for him, someone else's ring. He asked me 3 questions before leaving. What questions? Whether my memory had returned, whether I recognized anyone in the palace, and whether I knew the name Thessalmarin. That name moved through Nara like cold water through a crack in stone. Thessalmarin was the widow of the previous Alpha King's 2nd counselor. She lived in rooms in the palace's north wing. She was rarely seen, rarely mentioned, and regarded with a particular kind of careful blankness by anyone who held a position they wanted to keep. What did you tell him? Nara asked. That I didn't recognize anyone, he said. That my memory was still unclear. He looked at her steadily. I told him the truth. But his voice had a quality that made her think the truth was doing a significant amount of work in that sentence. She made a decision then. Standing in the small linen overflow room with the smell of the kitchen still on her clothes, and the morning light falling across the narrow bed where a man, she was becoming increasingly certain was. Not a nameless stranger watched her from behind a chosen silence. I think someone is trying to determine if you remember something specific, she said. And I think whoever is sending the nervous boy with the borrowed ring is also the reason no one looked very hard for you when you arrived. He was very still. I'm going to ask you something, she said. And I'm asking because I have apparently decided to be involved in this, which I did not intend, and I need to know how much I don't know. She met his eyes directly. Is your life in danger inside this palace? A long pause. I think, he said slowly, that the answer to that question depends on what you do next. It was the first genuinely honest thing she was certain he had said. He didn't tell her his name that day, but he told her something else. He told her about the ambush. Not all of it. Pieces. A river crossing on the road toward Thornwater. Armed men, more than the scouting report had suggested possible, positioned in the specific gaps that a royal traveling party would create. His own guards overwhelmed in the first quarter minute, which indicated timing that required either exceptional coordination or inside information about the route. He had made it across the river. Most of his party had not, or had been separated. He had followed the palace road as the most direct path, and had collapsed at the gate he found first. The kitchen gate, she said. Yes. And you decided to pretend you didn't know who you were. He said nothing, which was an answer. Because you didn't know who had arranged the ambush, she said. And because the safest thing was to be nobody while you found out. A man who knows nothing, he said quietly, is not a threat. And a man who is not a threat is allowed to remain alive, she finished. She sat down on the chair near the table, because she needed to sit. I need to understand something, she said. The treaty negotiation you were traveling toward. Thornwater borders. What was that about? The border territories have been contested for 3 generations. The current negotiation, he stopped himself. started again more carefully. There is a significant amount of land at stake. And there is at least one family in this palace whose position depends on that land never being formally transferred. Thessa Marin, she said. His eyes changed. Not dramatic, just a slight recalibration behind the gray. You know her. I know what she is. Nara had been careful not to let that knowledge be visible until now. Her family has held the management contracts for all 3 border territory trading routes for 40 years. A formal treaty would restructure those contracts. Remove the management rights. Someone from Varenthorn's court would have to certify the transfer. She paused. And someone from Varenthorn's court apparently decided the easier solution was a different kind of removal. He was quiet for a moment that felt very full. You know considerably more than a kitchen maid should about territorial trade contracts, he said. My father was an archivist in the provincial records office until he died, she said. I grew up reading ledgers the way other children read stories. She looked at him steadily. And you know considerably more than a man with no memory should about ambush timing and royal negotiations. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have stopped pretending and not yet decided what to do about it. Aldrich, he said. Just that. Just the name. She nodded. She did not react beyond that, though something shifted in her understanding with the weight of a stone settling into water. She had known. Not known the name, but known the shape of what he was. Nara fell, she said. Kitchen maid. Apparently also an archivist's daughter who has gotten herself into something very complicated. I'm sorry, he said. And she believed it, which made it worse. The plan had to be simple because she had simple materials. What she had, access to the kitchen and its adjoining passage, which connected through a service corridor to the East Wing records room that was locked on Tuesdays, but not on other days. When the junior archivists came to file weekly expenditure reports and often left the door insufficiently latched. What she had, for years of invisibility that allowed her to walk through corridors that she technically was not meant to occupy, carrying a tray or a basket or a bundle of herbs, and have every person she passed look through her as if she were furniture. What she had, a memory for detail that her father had called a gift and her mother had called an affliction. What Aldrich had, the knowledge of exactly what he was looking for. The management contracts for the border territories would have to be registered in the palace records as active instruments. If Thessa Marin's family held them, the documentation would exist in the East Wing. More importantly, any alteration to those contracts, any communication requesting delay or obstruction of the treaty, would be filed as an administrative action. Because the palace bureaucracy was meticulous. Cavan was meticulous. Cavan filed everything, and Cavan did not know that anyone was looking. She went on a Thursday afternoon. The East Wing records room was indeed unlocked. She walked through it with a basket of folded table linens. She had taken them from the supply closet near the kitchen, and she moved at the pace of a person who was not interested in the room, only passing through it, and she kept her eyes on the shelves with the careful unfocus of someone who is professionally bored. The contract files were in the lower tier, organized by territory, by year, by instrument number. She had learned that organizational system from her father before she was 10 years old. She found the border territory section in 40 seconds. She located the most recent filing in 30 more. And there, in the same hand as the kitchen gate notation she had found 4 days earlier, Lord Cavan's hand, was a communication dated 3 weeks ago. An advisory note to the royal secretary, recommending postponement of the Thornwater Treaty process pending further review of territorial impact assessments. Standard bureaucratic language. The kind of document that sat in a file for years and did nothing unless someone read it against everything else. But beneath it, tucked inside the same folder, was a different document. Not in Cavan's hand. In a woman's hand. She recognized it from nothing. But something about the precision of the letters suggested someone who wrote frequently and expected to be understood. This document was a list of names. 12 names. She recognized 7 of them as members of the Alpha King's traveling guard. Next to 4 of those names, small marks, crosses, and next to 3 of the names, circles. She understood, looking at it, that the circles indicated the men who had received instructions regarding route timing. The crosses indicated the men who had not, because they could not be trusted to comply. She was holding evidence of premeditated ambush. Her hands were steady. She was a woman who had learned very young that shaking your hands in a moment of shock is a luxury that the situation generally cannot afford. She memorized the document. She committed the names to memory, the marks, the date at the top of the page, the slight tear in the lower right corner where someone had gripped it too hard. She put everything back. She picked up her linens basket. She walked out. She took the long way back to the kitchen. She needed the time. She told Aldrich everything that evening, sitting at the small table in the linen overflow room with 2 cups of tea because her hands needed something to do. He listened without interrupting. That was another thing she had come to notice about him. He did not interrupt, did not redirect, did not offer the corrective commentary that men in authority positions often use to demonstrate they were still the most important person in a room. He listened with his whole attention, which was a particular kind of respect she had rarely been given. When she finished, he said, "The circles and the crosses. Yes. You're certain the date was 3 weeks ago. The ink shade. My father taught me to read ink age. 3 weeks is consistent." He set down his teacup. "There are 3 guard members on that list who are currently in this palace. Cavan sent word 3 days ago that they returned with the main party." He paused. "If that list is accurate, 2 of them were given route timing instructions. They would know who gave the orders. They would also be terrified," she said. "Yes. And reaching them without alerting Cavan, or whoever Cavan reports to, Thessa Marin," he said. "Cavan reports to her. He has for 11 years. She manages the trading contracts. He manages the administrative record. They are the same operation." He sat back. She would have known that killing me creates complications. A dead Alpha King creates succession chaos, which is bad for business. A missing Alpha King, however, with an appropriate replacement gradually maneuvered into position. "There's a successor candidate," Nara said, and it was not a question. Because she had been thinking since she left the records room, and she had arrived at the same place he had. "My cousin Petrin. He has been Thessa Marin's preferred candidate for 8 years. Her daughter is his chosen mate. If I disappear long enough, he assumes temporary authority. If I remain missing for 2 cycles of the law, 6 months, he assumes permanent authority." "How long have you been missing?" 6 days, he said. The number sat between them. "So we have time," she said. "Not as much as that implies. If Cavan suspects the memory loss is performance, the calculation changes. A living Alpha King who knows what happened is more dangerous than a dead one, if the record can be discredited. If I can be branded unstable after a traumatic injury. If the witnesses can be managed," she said. "Yes." She thought for a moment. "The 2 guards on the list. The ones who received route timing instructions. Do you know them well enough to know which would be more frightened and which would be more angry?" He looked at her. "An angry man," she said, "might be persuaded to act. A frightened man needs to know that not acting has consequences too. You'd approach them? You can't. You're a man with no memory, remember." She said it without bitterness, but precisely. "I'm a kitchen maid who brings food to the servants' wing. I have a reason to be anywhere in that part of the palace." Nara. His voice had a quality she had not heard from him before. A kind of friction, like someone pressing a brake. "These men were at the ambush. They let my guards be killed. I know what they did." She met his gaze. "I'm not forgiving it. I'm using it." She found the first one, a man named Bryn, that same evening. He was sitting alone in the servants' mess, eating nothing, staring at the wall with the expression of a person whose conscience has been having a very long argument with his self-preservation and neither side has won yet. She had seen that expression before, on suppliers who had submitted false weights to the kitchen and were waiting to find out if anyone had checked. She set a plate in front of him. Not because he needed feeding, because having a reason to be standing at his table was essential. "You look like a man who hasn't slept," she said, in the tone she used for talking to anyone in the servants' quarters who she wanted to sound simply neighborly. He looked at her with the particular wariness of a person who has been waiting for something to happen and is not sure if this is it. She sat down across from him, which was slightly more familiar than a kitchen maid usually was, but not outlandishly so. "There's a man in the linen overflow room in the east servants' wing," she said, very quietly. "He's been there 6 days with a head injury and no memory of who he is." She paused. "He has gray eyes, and a scar along his left forearm, about 3 inches from what looks like a knife." Bryn's face went perfectly white. "He'll be found eventually," she said. When he is, there will be people who want to explain him away. And there will be one person who can contradict that explanation. She let the silence do its work. I'm not asking you to be that person tonight. I'm asking you to think about what happens to the men who let this be buried, and what happens to the ones who don't. She took back the plate she had never actually given him and walked away. She gave him until morning. At 7 o'clock the following morning, the guard named Bryn appeared at the kitchen gate asking for the kitchen maid who had spoken with him the night before. He was not alone. The second man from the list, a guard named Osset, was behind him. Osset had the look of someone who had made his decision and was now furiously committed to it. She brought them to the linen overflow room. Aldrich saw them and was entirely still for 3 seconds. Bryn made a sound that was not quite words and went down to one knee on the stone floor. Osset followed, and Osset was shaking, and it was the shaking of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for 6 days and has just been told he can set it down. My lord, Bryn said, we were told you were dead. They told us when we returned. Cavan told us himself that you had not made it across the river, that the body had been recovered, Aldrich said, and his voice had changed. No longer the careful, stripped-down quality she had heard all week. Something deeper, something that carried weight in the way that good architecture carries weight, not loudly, but unmistakably. Stand up. They stood. Tell me what you were given, he said. The route timing instructions. Who delivered them, and in whose name? Bryn and Osset told him everything. It took 20 minutes. Nara stayed, because she had committed to this room and this situation, and she was not the kind of woman who left a room because the conversation had become consequential. She learned that the instructions had been delivered verbally by Cavan himself, attributed to a royal administrative scheduling decision, framed in language that made the route timing seem like a logistical convenience. She learned that neither Bryn nor Osset had understood, until the ambush happened, what the timing was for. She learned that 4 of the men who had received instructions were dead, not at the ambush. After returning to the palace, 3 assigned to patrol routes in the outer territory, deep territory, the kind of route where a man could disappear into the forest. 1 dead of a sudden illness. She looked at Aldrich when that last detail was delivered. He was not looking at her. He was looking at a point somewhere between the 2 guards and the wall, and his jaw was a very controlled line. The document she found in the records room, he said finally, meaning her. And both guards turned briefly toward her with an expression she understood, the expression of people recalibrating who was important in a room they had entered with certain assumptions. Names and marks. You'll both verify the marks beside your names. Yes, Osset said. Whatever you need, my lord. The confrontation happened publicly. Aldrich had considered a private approach. She knew this because he had described it to her that evening, the logic of it. The way a private resolution might be faster and cleaner and less disruptive to the court. She had listened, and then she had said, with the particular directness that seemed to have become their common language, for men are dead. 2 more were threatened. And the woman who ordered it has been managing this palace from a comfortable north wing apartment for 11 years. Private doesn't seem proportionate. He had been quiet for a long moment. No, he had said. It doesn't. The great hall of Varenthorn was not, as halls of that kind go, especially grand. It was stone and dark wood and high windows, and in the morning it smelled of the fires that had been burning since before dawn in the adjoining chambers. But it held 30 people standing, and standing in it that morning were Lord Cavan, Thessamarin, the court counselors who had been performing an increasingly anxious holding pattern for 6 days, and the full palace guard, including Bryn and Osset, who had spent the previous night writing sworn statements in the presence of Master Brennick, who had been, apparently, a man of genuine integrity under his professional pride, and who had signed those statements as witness without hesitation. Nara stood to one side of the hall, near the passage doorway, because she had been told she might be needed and because she intended to see this through regardless. She watched Thessamarin's face at the moment Aldrich walked into the hall. The woman was not young, perhaps 55, with the particular elegance of someone who had spent decades in close proximity to power and understood how to occupy a room. She dressed in dark blue. Her hair was gray and precise. And when Aldrich walked through the great hall's main doors, dressed not in torn wool, but in the clothes appropriate to his rank that Bryn had retrieved from the sealed royal suite with authorization no one had thought to rescind, She went very still. Not frightened. Not yet. Calculating. Cavan's face was different. Cavan's face was the face of a man who had made a very specific bet and had just watched the conditions of that bet fundamentally change. Aldrich walked to the center of the hall. He did not need to call for silence. It arrived around him the way quiet arrives around a signal fire when the person watching it finally understands what it means. I have been in this palace for 6 days, he said. Not in the rooms appropriate to my rank. In a room off the kitchen passage, with a head injury and borrowed circumstances. Waiting to understand who in my own court had arranged for an armed ambush on the road to Thornwater. The hall was very quiet. I know the answer, he said. The records office knows the answer. The sworn statements of surviving guards, which have been witnessed and sealed this morning, provide the answer in considerable detail. He looked directly at Thessamaran. The border territory management contracts will be reviewed and transferred as part of the Thornwater Treaty, which will proceed. Lord Cavan will surrender his administrative authority and be remanded to the court magistrate pending full investigation. And the deaths of the 4 guards who returned to this palace and were subsequently silenced will be investigated with the full authority of Crown law. Thessamaran said, with impressive composure. These are very serious claims from a man who has apparently been hiding, Aldrich said. Yes, in a very useful location. And he looked, briefly, toward the passage doorway where Nara was standing. She had not expected to be looked at. She had not expected the room to follow that look. 30 sets of eyes, briefly, on a kitchen maid in a work apron standing in a doorway. She did not drop her gaze. Thessamaran's composure broke at its edges. A kitchen maid and 2 disgruntled guards. A kitchen maid, Aldrich said, who went into the records room with a linen basket and retrieved specific evidence while everyone in this palace was looking through her, because she was not considered important enough to be considered a threat. His voice was controlled but had a precise edge in it. I would like everyone in this hall to spend a moment thinking about what that says. He turned back to the magistrate's representative, who had been summoned early that morning and was standing very alertly near the left pillar. The sworn statements are available for review, he said. Begin. The legal process took time. It always did. What happened immediately was Cavan's removal from administrative authority and his placement under guard in his own apartments. What happened less immediately, but that same afternoon, was Thessamaran's formal appearance before the court magistrate, accompanied by the sworn statements, the records document, and the testimony of Bryn and Osset, who were pale but entirely steady and who looked, Nara thought, like men who had set down something very heavy and were deciding they would not pick it up again. Nara was present for the opening of that proceeding because she had been asked to describe how she had found the document and what it contained. She stood before the magistrate and gave her account in precise, sequential detail, including the ink age assessment and the organizational structure of the records files, which established clearly that the document had not been misplaced or mislabeled, but was exactly where it was intended to be. The magistrate asked her several questions. She answered all of them. When she was dismissed, she walked back toward the kitchen because the midday meal still needed to happen, and she was the one responsible for it. She was halfway down the passage when Aldrich appeared behind her. She heard the footsteps and recognized them without turning. She had spent a week listening to the sound of him moving around a small room. Nara. She stopped. She turned. He was still in his rank-appropriate clothes, which suited him in the way that honest things generally suit the people they belong to. He looked, she thought, like someone who had been carrying a very specific kind of weight for 6 days and had not yet found his balance without it. The kitchen has needs, she said. I'm behind. The kitchen can wait 3 minutes. The bread can't. He almost smiled. She caught the almost before it completed. Then I'll be direct. He paused. What you did this week, you would have found another way, she said. Because it was true, and because she needed it to be said plainly, needed the distinction between what she had done out of conviction and what would have happened regardless of her. Perhaps, he said, more slowly, with more risk, and alone. She met his gaze. You weren't alone. No, he said. I wasn't. The passage was dim, morning light coming from the single high window at the far end. She could hear the kitchen sounds through the door. The assistants had started without her, which was either progress or a disaster she was about to walk into. What happens now? She asked. Because she was a practical woman and the question was practical. The treaty would proceed. The court would restructure around the removal of two of its major administrative figures. There would be weeks of legal proceedings and the necessary reshaping of things that had been wrong for 11 years. She understood all of that. She was asking something else. He knew it. "I don't know yet," he said, and she respected him for that answer. "But I know what this week was. I know what I observed. And I know that a man who has spent most of his authority surrounded by people who see only the rank should probably not be careless with the person who treated him like something more than that." She looked at him for a long moment. "I treated you like a person," she said. "That shouldn't be a remarkable thing." "In my experience," he said quietly, "it is." She thought about that. She thought about the stable hands who stepped around him, the steward who chose a different path, the physicians who filed their reports and washed their hands, the court that had performed 7 days of anxious holding pattern politics while a man they owed their authority to lay in a linen overflow room eating reheated bread. She thought about what it meant to have been powerful your entire life and never once had someone bring you soup, because it was simply the sensible thing to do. "I need to go save the bread," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned toward the kitchen door. "Nara." His voice, just her name, and the quality of it was different again. Not the guarded version, not the authoritative version, but the version she had first heard when he said Juniper. When he said an argument you're having with the ingredients. When he was simply, briefly, a man with a headache who noticed things. She turned back. "If I came to the kitchen tomorrow morning," he said, "not as what I am, just as someone who wanted to understand how you make that broth, would you explain it?" The question was so carefully constructed. The care in it was its own answer, its own vulnerability. "The juniper has to be added at the end," she said. "Most people add it at the beginning. It matters which way you do it." "I'll remember," he said. She went back to the kitchen. Thessa Marin was formally remanded to trial 6 weeks later. The charges were extensive: conspiracy to obstruct royal proceedings, administrative fraud across 11 years of falsified contract records, and complicity in the deaths of 4 palace guards, which the investigation connected conclusively to instructions originating in the North Wing. Her daughter's betrothal to cousin Petrin was dissolved by Petrin himself, who appeared to have been, throughout this entire period, neither a conspirator nor an active participant, merely a convenient instrument whom Thessa Marin had kept carefully uninformed, because useful candidates function best when they are plausibly ignorant. Petrin came to the kitchen one afternoon, unannounced, and asked to speak with Nara Fell. He was a younger man than she had expected, perhaps 28, with an honest face and the slightly embarrassed expression of someone who is aware that his name has appeared in a complicated story and who wants it understood that his appearance there was not his design. He asked her if there was anything she needed, anything the situation had cost her. He was not certain, he said, what the proper protocol was for thanking a kitchen maid for inadvertently preventing one's own elevation to a throne one had not sought. But he wanted to make the attempt. She gave him tea and told him she was fine. He told her that Aldrich had asked him to convey that the Treaty of Thornwater had been formally ratified, and that the border territory management contracts had been restructured, and that the families of the 4 deceased guards had been notified and would receive full honors and compensation. She thanked him, and he left, and she stood at the work table for a moment thinking about a list with marks beside names, and about 4 men who had come back from a road, and then had not come back from anything else. The justice for them was the right kind, documented, formal, proportionate, and she was glad of it. She was also glad that gladness had a particular weight to it rather than being clean and simple, because 4 people's families were still grieving, and that should cost something to think about. Aldrich came to the kitchen the next morning, and the morning after that. He came the way she had said he could, not as what he was, simply as someone who wanted to understand how the broth was made. He asked intelligent questions and made the same kind of precise observations she had noticed that first week, and he was willing to be wrong about things, which was the most useful quality in a person learning a new skill. He burned a reduction on the 3rd morning because he had been talking and forgotten to watch the heat, and he said a word under his breath that was entirely undignified for an alpha king. And Nara laughed, genuinely, from the chest, the kind of laugh she had not had reason for in some time. He looked at her when she laughed. She looked back. "You should laugh more often," he said. "So should you," she said. And it was not the beginning of something easy. Nothing that had happened in the preceding weeks made it easy. There was too much distance between their positions, too much that would need to be carefully and honestly considered. Too many people in the court and beyond it who would have opinions about an alpha king who spent mornings in the kitchen learning to make juniper broth from a kitchen maid. There was the legal work still ongoing. There was the treaty still being implemented. There were 4 dead guards whose families deserved to see the full proceedings through. There was all of that, and it was real, and neither of them was the kind of person who pretended real things were smaller than they were. But he came to the kitchen. He kept coming. And she explained the broth, and the bread, and the argument she had with the rosemary about whether it wanted to be used early or late in a process. And he listened the way he had listened during the worst week she had ever participated in, with his whole attention, like she was worth every fraction of it. One morning, she came in before dawn to find a small glass jar on the work table, filled with dried juniper berries of a quality better than what the kitchen normally received, and a note written in the precise hand of a man who had signed many documents and knew how to make his meaning clear. The note said, "For the end of the process, where it matters." She set the note down carefully on the table. She stood there in the early dark of the kitchen, with the fire needing to be built up and the bread needing to be started, the whole long day of work waiting for her hands. And she thought about a man lying in the mud who everyone had stepped around. She thought about the way she had set down her herbs on the stone wall and walked toward him, not because she was brave, not because she knew who he was, but because it was the sensible thing to do. She had thought, then, that she didn't want complications. She thought now that the word complication was doing a great deal of work to describe the feeling of having one person in the world who paid attention to the specific quality of what you made, not its utility, not its function, not the fact that it sustained the people who ate it, but the argument in it, the care in it, the specific human choice of when to add the juniper. She started building up the fire. When he arrived an hour later, she set him to work on the bread, which required attention and patience and the willingness to fail a few times before getting it right. He was willing. She thought that was probably the most important thing. Thank you so much for spending this time with this story. If you made it all the way to the end, I genuinely want to know, where are you listening from right now? Drop your city, your country, anything at all in the comments. And if Nara's quiet courage and Aldrich's careful honesty moved something in you the way they moved something in me while telling this, please leave a like and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. There are more stories waiting, and they are made for you.